Yes, my name is Bernie Anderson. I work with World Relief and have been with World Relief for about a year and a half. My background is, I was in the pastorate for about 13 years, and then my family actually served in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia for a better part of a decade, eight years or so. We came back to the U.S. about a year and a half ago, and I've been with World Relief for about that time. So my role at World Relief is to work with churches in the Southeast, and some of you I've already actually spent some time with this week. I think a few of you I spent some time with when I was here in Birmingham before. It's a privilege to be in your city. I'd see so much momentum with churches here around this subject and around a topic that is super important. Just one little, World Relief, there are other Christian organizations that do resettle refugees. World Relief works almost exclusively with local churches, and that's kind of the differentiator. Catholic Charities, Lutheran Services, there's other faith-based organizations, but we also work in 20 different countries around the world, working with churches and working with local churches to deal with issues like trafficking and cyclical poverty, and to see the most vulnerable peoples of the world to experience the love and the grace and the profound ministry of Jesus in a way that is in both word and deed. So that's what we do. But today I want to talk to you a little bit about a topic that probably most of you in this room are somewhat familiar with, particularly now that we have seen pictures like this one that have shown up on our Facebook feeds. As a photographer or amateur photographer, it's interesting to me that it was a photograph that really opened up the eyes, I think, of most people in America about what is happening in the Middle East and what is happening in relation to the Syrian refugee crisis. I remember the day this photograph showed up on Facebook feeds, and it's disturbing. It is a disturbing picture. It's one that I couldn't look at for several days without kind of tearing up. I mean, it's somebody's kid who washed up on the beach. I think what happened when this photograph began to circulate is that people began to ask questions for the first time. People in the United States, anyway, those of us who are used to news that changes daily, and big story today is not such a big story tomorrow. And so we began to ask questions like, what's happening over there? Why is it that somebody's kid would be drowned and washed up on a beach? How does that happen? Why are people getting into boats and making this harrowing journey across waters that putting their families at risk to get away from something, and began to ask those questions? How did this crisis happen? How could we let this crisis happen? And the U.S. press corps, I think, after that point, I mean, there had been little blips along the way. Some of it I may have missed because I was living in another country at the time. But it just seems like it was at that point that people began to talk, and the story was picked up, and of course a toddler that's washed up on the beach who's drowned is something that it seems like the media, you get ratings with that, I guess. It reminded me a lot of Neil Postman's word that where he, I've just lost it. Sorry. There we go. That our daily news is inert and consists of information that gives us something to talk about, but not lead to any meaningful action. And that's one of those things that I think the story kind of did that. There was a lot of talk and a lot of questions about how do we do this. And I had people calling me. I had churches that were calling me saying, hey, how do we get involved with this? And this was good. This was good motive. This was something what do we do? How do we help these people? And I mean, I had churches calling me, and they were wanting to, do some more helpful than others. I mean, let's get together a bunch of sleeping bags and yoga mats and send them over there, or canned food, or how do we do a clothing drive or whatever, and all of this was good, and that lasted for several weeks actually. Those weeks right after that photograph hit the internet and the news feed, myself and my team, we were working, 12, 15-hour days sometimes because of all of the talk. How do we do something? But then something else happened several weeks later that changed the conversation. And the Paris bombings happened, and it was a situation where the conversation began to change somewhat drastically and moved from how can we help to, are we going to actually let those people come over here? And they're legitimate questions. I don't want to downplay that. Legitimate questions. Are we going to allow this to happen in America? So if we allow refugees to come into America, will that, and at that point, the talk began to get a little bit carried away simply because politicians got involved, I think. I think it's one of those things, and I don't know if this equation is correct, but if you get a terrorist attack and then you get people trying to run for president, like beginning to talk about how to avoid terrorist attacks and get votes, I think it gets really noisy. It just gets really noisy. And I don't know, I'm not here to talk about politics. I don't know where you stand politically, and it doesn't matter to me. Because I think there's a bigger issue at stake than red and blue. I think there's a bigger issue at stake that we need to think through. Now, I'm going to just say this because I think it's important for you to know that. Personally and as an organization, I mean, World Relief is very, very adamant that refugees and security are important issues. I wouldn't want anybody to walk away from here thinking, well, World Relief doesn't really care about security, national security. We do very deeply. We think refugee resettlement needs to be secure and vetted. But here's the thing. It is. Like, maybe there's some things that could be added to it, but the refugee resettlement in America is the most vetted way for any immigrant to come into this country. And that's something we can talk about later. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but I can give you a lot of information about how well vetted the refugee resettlement program in this country is. It has more security measures than any other way to come into the country. The United States government, in cooperation with the United Nations, absolutely should vet any and every refugee who comes into this country, and the reality is they do. And I think that's just important to know. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. As we think about refugees and this global crisis, I think that there are some other questions that need to be answered. I think there's other issues that need to be talked about. And I want to kind of bear in mind, I live in Greenville, South Carolina. That's where my home base is right now. And it's not, politically speaking, not all that different than Birmingham, Alabama. We're a solidly red state that World Relief opened an office in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and it was kind of interesting, some of the conversations that came out of that. So my appeal today is not to talk about conservative politics. It's not to talk about liberal politics. It's not to talk about where any of us are in light of that. We can all have very different opinions about that, and I don't have a problem with that. That's good discussion. But I'd like to talk to you today, whether you support Bernie Sanders or whether you support Donald Trump. I want to talk to you today not as a political person, but as a person who is aligned with the teachings of Jesus Christ, the person of Jesus Christ. I want to talk to us today, or think today, about where our allegiances are as far as who we have said that we follow in following the teachings and the person of Jesus. I think that's really, really important when it comes to something like this, because, again, it's hard for us to do this at times. But I think that those things need to be separated to a certain extent, at least in thinking in terms of this global refugee crisis. I think we have to think of it in terms of our allegiance to Jesus. And that's how does the church think about this issue in a biblical way? And that can be challenging because there's varieties here in this room, I'm sure, of how we even begin to do that. But I think it's important for us to think of this. How do we think of this as Christians? How do we walk through this as believers? I think there's two sides to that. I think there's two sides to thinking about this as Christians, as believers. I think one side is thinking of it in terms of the pragmatics of it. This is really the great missiological opportunity of our day. I think that's super important to understand. I think it's super important to just think about that, because this is one of those things that is historical. There's been nothing like this since World War II, where we have this massive migration of people. And in this case, it's a massive migration of people who, until they began to move, had little access to the gospel. Some of them are Christians, it's true, but many of the people coming out of Syria are Muslim and have had very little access to Christianity, to the gospel. Things in the Middle East tend to be quite segregated as far as who interacts with whom. The Christians and the Muslims aren't necessarily interacting with each other, and it's illegal to become a Christian if you are born Muslim. So this event is huge, and actually, historically speaking, I think it's probably important to realize that this is not new. Those of you who are students here who are studying history of mission, I'm assuming there's a history of mission class of some sort, you're going to find that the gospel has moved around the world through the migration of people oftentimes. And God uses, I love this quote from Hansili Fuller, the connection between migration and God's salvific purposes is deeply rooted in the biblical story and strongly manifest through Christian history. So you start with Abraham and you follow that thread of the gospel story from Abraham to now, and you'll find that it's migration has a big part of it. It's a big part of that story, and I think that's important to realize and to recognize that, just practically speaking, this crisis that we face, a humanitarian crisis that we face, is also a huge historical event that I think is important missiologically speaking. I think philosophically is the other side. There's like this pragmatic side, and I think there's kind of a philosophical side. I think that means that we as the church have to respond to this greatest humanitarian crisis of our day with the compassion and the love of Jesus. How do we respond to that? What does that look like? Here's an important thing, and I want to make this super clear. As we think about this crisis, and I'm going to talk about this again in a minute, but just to make this point, it's super important to realize that it's not just about bringing refugees to America. That's a small portion. It's not the answer. It's a small portion of just relief and kind of helping to relieve the burden of those countries that are really bearing the weight of this crisis. It's not just about that. And I think sometimes in our news media and in our politics, it becomes about, because it's connected so often with okay, we've got this refugee thing, we have all these people coming into America, so let's just deal with immigration, and so we'll build walls and shut our borders or do whatever it is that people are saying that we should do now. It's a much bigger issue than that, and I think as the church we have to think about this in terms of kind of how do we respond? How do we respond? I'm going to back up just a second because I think it's important to respond with good information. I'm just going to say this ahead of time. Many of you may already, at least in this audience, are probably already aware of some of this, but the reality is many of your neighbors aren't. Many of your neighbors are responding to the sound bites that we hear on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC or wherever, and that's what they base their decision making on. And I don't think this room is one in which that probably happens much, but I think it's important to recognize a couple of things, such as this Syrian refugee crisis is not 5 months old, it's 5 years old, and actually, I would argue it's older than that. I mean, the actual migration began about 5 years ago when during Syria's civil war. For many, it's again the CNN image, the kid on the beach, and oh, there's a crisis going on. But it's been going on since 2011. The Syrian civil war actually has roots that are much deeper than that, and much more complex than even the Arab Spring uprisings and all that went against the Assad regime, and all of that. It's much more complex than that. I'm not a political scientist. There may be political scientists in this room, and I defer to you on this if that be the case, but I do think it's fairly evident and fairly well documented that foreign policy of at least 2 different U.S. administrations, one Republican, one Democrat, really played key roles in catalyzing what's happened in Syria. That's something that the destruction we see is, I think as a country, we bear responsibility for this. And again, realizing that civil wars are complex beasts that cannot really be so superficially analyzed. It's important that I think we move away from the sound bites and realize that this is a huge problematic issue that's quite complex. Senator John Kerry, I think it was a couple of years ago, in talking about this was kind of using good guy, bad guy terminology, and it's interesting to me because I think we have to remember that we're trained sometimes to think in terms of Marvel comic books. I think I mean there's the good guys over here and the bad guys over here, and they're fighting each other. So I remember when my son was little that he would always want to know that, like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's the team we should root for and who's the team that we should root against. And in the case of the Syrian crisis, it's hard. I don't think we can make it that simplistic. I don't think we can put it into the context of Marvel comic books, because the regime and the rebels against the regime and ISIS and the other groups that are fighting each other in that have all committed atrocities that to me are unspeakable. From gassing their own people to mass beheadings that we've seen on the news to the threats of genocide and attempts at genocide that have taken place through the forces fighting against Assad's regime. It's really complex, and it's something that again we can't just take a simplistic view on. We do need to understand that it's the Syrian people, though, who have been the ones who suffered through this. That's why there are masses of people who are leaving their home. And it's the people of Syria, and again, in spite of certain blitz that have come up on the internet, it's actually, and I can verify this with people that World Relief has on the ground in Jordan and in Turkey and in other parts of the Middle East, the majority of the people coming out of Syria are not military-age young men. They're women and children. That report that we hear at times is absolutely false. And I tell you that because of people we have on the ground that this is what they see. And so, like, putting that into context, 12 million people, and growing daily, are displaced. Some inside of the country, some outside of the country. Some are, the numbers vary, but about 4 million, 4.5 million, something like this, who are refugees who've fled the country, and the rest are all displaced within their own country. That to put like that, I don't begin to understand the scope of that. I mean, that would be like the entire state of Alabama, plus the entire state of Mississippi, plus the majority of the state of Arkansas, at least based on the census numbers that I saw, like those 3 states, all of the people within those 3 states having their homes destroyed, having to leave where they live, because if they stayed where they live, they would put their lives and their families' lives in mortal danger. I think we need to stop and think about that for a minute. I've heard people say, oh, well, they're just trying to get over here to get a better life. That's so wrong. That's not true. The danger in staying in Syria is real enough for people to risk their lives to get away from it, because it's safer to put your kids in a boat and cross the Mediterranean Sea than it is to stay home. And that's the seriousness of it. We have to realize that this is a very real thing for these people. So, in light of that, again, that's probably not new information for most of you, but it is information that sometimes doesn't get reported on a regular basis. So what do we do? As the church, I think this is what we have to come to and realize and recognize and walk in. The church, I believe, is the answer for this. I think God is positioning the Church of Jesus Christ around the world to be some major portion of this solution. But I want us to think about this. Is it a solution? So what is the difference between a solution and a response? I don't think today in this room we could have enough conversation to come up with solutions for an issue that is this complex. I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe that we can come up with some, simplistic answer and have no-fly zones and do all. It's a bigger issue than that. However, I'm convinced that the church is really not called to figure out the solution, at least at this point. I think we are called to be the solution as we respond to what's happening. I really believe that. I believe that the church can be the solution. And in that, it's really a defining moment for the church in our generation, your generation. I think it's a moment for the church to really be the church in ways that we've never had the opportunity to be before. It's huge, I think. Does the U.S. government need to welcome refugees? Well, I think so. But I don't think that's the important question. I don't think that's the big question. I think the big important question is, does the church need to welcome refugees? That's the question that needs to be answered. And I think there aren't a whole lot of things that we can put into doubt about that. Yes, we do. We do. The church needs to welcome the stranger. Welcoming the stranger is a theme in the Bible. And it's something that, again, goes from Genesis to Revelation. You can find that throughout all of the scriptures. We can't ignore that. We can't ignore suffering of this magnitude and the church be like, oh, that's kind of happening over there. Or the church in America saying, hey, I hope that the church in the Middle East can figure this out because, man, we can't. I think this is an opportunity, an interesting day in which we live, in which the global church can come together and work together, cross denominations, cross lines that maybe haven't been crossed in a really long time, to say, how do we respond to this? Because it's a church issue. This is something, now why? Why is that? Well, I think it's rooted in the gospel. I think we go back to really, we can talk about the Bible, talk about how this is rooted in the Bible, migration in the Bible, we'll talk about welcoming the stranger in the Bible, but it really comes to the core of the gospel. Our response to the global refugee crisis must be deeply rooted in the gospel that we say we believe. Because the basics of the gospel are, you know what those are. The basics of the gospel being that God in Christ moved into our neighborhood. The basics of the gospel being that when Jesus came, he knew he would be ridiculed and despised and persecuted and rejected. And he came knowing that he would not be welcomed. I mean, superficially welcomed, but not welcomed in a way that the Son of God should be welcomed. But he moved in. And while we were yet sinners, he moved in. While we were yet enemies of the cross that he was to bear, he moved in. The gospel is really at the core of this whole thing, of our response to the refugee crisis. Because Jesus came, and in one sense, we then come to him. He came and he lived, he died, rose again, and now we really come to him as kind of in the same position. It's like, wait a minute, I'm the one who's I'm the one who's lost and wandering around. I'm the one who doesn't have a home, who doesn't have a place, who doesn't have an identity. And so the gospel really gives us that, doesn't it? The gospel is what gives us that identity. He became nothing and died for us. And so the most basic and most profound truth that any of us will ever know is that truth, that Jesus became like us and died for us and took our place and bore our sin. And so the response to this then is, and again, Matthew 25 gets thrown around a lot and stuff like this. I know that. But it really ties the gospel right there, doesn't it? That as you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. That's exactly what that means, because Jesus became one of us. It's rooted deeply and profoundly in the gospel. The essence of God's love for us is that greater love is no one than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. Sacrificial love. We can't, the solution to this refugee crisis isn't going to be writing checks. You can't buy a solution for this. I do believe the solution for this is going to be for us to roll up our sleeves and get involved with the messiness of ministry and serving and loving people and starting here, but thinking not just here. Again, we have to think both and. We can't just think, okay, well, we'll just do that here. We got to figure this out. And I don't know what the answer is in a lot of ways. I mean, I've got a couple things I'm going to throw up here for us to think about, but the capabilities of figuring that out are in this room. And you may know this, maybe you don't know this. Birmingham, Alabama, you're the second most Bible-minded city in the country. Did you know that? Just read that recently, American Bible Society. I don't know how they figured that out, but you guys are the second most Bible-minded city in the country. Birmingham, Alabama is also the largest city in the country where there's no refugee resettlement going on. It's interesting because where I live in Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, we're the 9th most Bible-minded city in the country. And yes, there's refugee resettlement going on, but boy, it's been fought tooth and nail. It's been interesting. But I don't know that the answer isn't saying, well, we need to resettle refugees in Birmingham. I think the answer is beginning to think through, like, okay, how do we respond to this in a biblical way? What are the things that we can do? I'm going to give you a few things that I suggest, and they're not anything that's really profound or, anything that's going to be new to you. But I hesitate in one sense to pray up there because I know you thought, oh yeah, I got to pray. But here's the thing. This thing is bigger than us. It's bigger than all of us. It's bigger than the church. I think the church needs to actively be praying for Syria, actively praying for the refugee crisis, actively saying, God, what do you want us to do? How do you want us to respond? I think prayer is a huge piece of this. Again, we have millions of underreached people coming into a place where they have access to the gospel for the first time in centuries. How do we respond? I think the first step is to begin to think through how to pray, to maybe cross denominational borders and pray with other churches, to have a citywide prayer meeting, to call the church to pray, and to maybe somehow let the world know that we're praying and we welcome anything that God would do. We would welcome any refugee that would come here. The thing is the people that are fleeing, they still have Facebook and Twitter. They know, this is, again, from people that I know on the ground over there, that people know the issues that are going on in America and see that, I don't know if I want to go to America or not. They're wanting to build a wall, and it's kind of scary. Maybe I'll go there, and it'll be worse than what I am facing here, and that's tragic. So pray, and I think letting the world know, hey, we're praying. And we're welcoming. That, I think, prayer leads to action. Advocate is maybe it is time for churches to give Senator Sessions and Shelby a call, to write a letter to Governor Bentley and say, I think that we as churches want to receive refugees. We want to be a part of that. We want to do that. I don't know what that looks like here, but I think that being an advocate for the vulnerable is something that the church should be walking in. I really do. Advocate with your people. If you're a leader in a church, advocate with them. And I would kind of segueing into the next one is really educate. Last night, found out about a message that was given by Pastor Flahart of Oak Mountain Presbyterian Church. He gave a great talk to his people on how do we show grace without borders, refugees. And it was a great talk. You should listen to it. It's online, their website. And so our church leadership should be talking to our people about this. Let's stop the false information that's going around. Let's get good information out there. You can go, I've got a couple websites that'll pop up here in a minute, that you can go to wewelcomerefugees.com, you can go to worldrelief.org, and there's a massive amount of material there that will be really helpful to get good information out as to what's happening, what's going on, that we're not trying to bring in a bunch of unvetted, checked out people that to blow up our buildings. No, that's not the case. I think we also have opportunities to support churches that are bearing the brunt of this. So I said a minute ago, we could bring in all 80,000 refugees that President Obama has said that he wants to, has said, hey, that's the number that's going to be for this year. And that is that's a 10th of 1% of the total refugees around the world. It's not many. It's basically just helping some of these nations that are really bearing the brunt of this, nations like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon, that are Germany, who have a real problem. It's a very different thing. And so how do we support churches there? How do we make partnerships with churches there? How do we connect with churches in that part of the world? How do we figure that out? And that's something I think we can have a discussion and figure out how to do that together. The church, I think how we respond will define the church for a generation. I think it's that big. I think this crisis is that big that how we respond to this is going to define this church for this generation. And I don't mean to be like an alarmist or to, overstate anything, because I try not to do that, but I think it's true. I think that's something that we have to consider. I think it's the greatest missiological opportunity of our time. But it's also the greatest opportunity of our time to show the love and the compassion of Jesus in a gospel-centered, gospel-oriented way. Now, in one sense, I've told you nothing today, and I realize that, because I don't have the answers, but I believe you do. I believe your church does. I believe your churches can begin discussions and begin to pray and begin to advocate and begin to act and begin to do things to begin to say, hey, how do we move forward in this? How do we connect with other churches around the world? How do we respond to this? And that's my encouragement to you today. Whether you're a student here at Beeson, whether you're a church leader or just someone in the community who's interested, I think the church is the answer to this. And I think the church will be the answer to this as the church begins to respond to this. And the gospel and the power of the Holy Spirit move through our churches to show the love and compassion of Christ to people that now have the opportunity to receive that in ways that they never did before. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to kind of leave that there. We're going to just. I've got some things up here. Again, not anything super profound, but pray and advocate and educate, support, I think are ways that we can begin having that conversation. That's my information. A couple of websites there. WeWelcomeRefugees.com, WorldRelief.org has fantastic collateral that I think will be really helpful for you, for your churches, for people in your small groups, for your students here to really get a deeper education, deeper understanding of what's really happening and what's really going on.